America has changed tremendously, and we all know this, right? I don't have to explain to you why or how this is. And we have seen a tremendous change in the United States, culturally, politically. America has changed tremendously. We've gone from Bush to Trump, as far as Republicans go. That's a big change. Neoconservatism has pretty much died, or is close to dead. What has become very popular is American isolationism or American protectionism. The United States has changed tremendously from what I call the 9/11 era to now. So what's the 9/11 era? I mean, the title is quite self-explanatory. The 9/11 era is a part of American history that took place right after the 9/11 attacks. You have the 9/11 attacks. We all remember it like it was yesterday, right? I mean, I remember it very well. I remember the 9/11 attacks very well. And what happened? America invaded Iraq. And the entire American population, well, not every American, generally speaking, the American population supported the Iraq War. Generally speaking, the U.S. government, Congress, supported the war in Iraq. And that changed everything. Americans, after 9/11, were very exuberant about war. They were very excited about war because they watched as thousands of their countrymen were slaughtered by Islamic terrorists. And after 9/11, they were extremely long lines of young Americans wanting to enlist into the military. And why did they want to join the military? Because they wanted to defend their country. It's quite obvious. So they joined the military. They went into Iraq, and they thought, we're fighting for our country. We're fighting terrorists. Then they realized, wait a second, Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. Saddam Hussein had nothing to do with 9/11. And the neocons said, well, that's because of faulty intelligence. That's why we invaded Iraq, because of bad intelligence, right? The intelligence sector told us that Saddam had some kind of connection to 9/11. So it wasn't that we lied, it's that we made a mistake. But either way you look at it, you have lost the trust of the American people. And we saw thousands of American soldiers being killed. They were killed in battles. They were killed by IEDs. Americans were lynched in Iraq. People were beheaded. Americans were beheaded in Iraq. Remember Nick Berg? Remember that Asian missionary who went to Iraq and he ended up getting beheaded? That was pretty disturbing. Very disturbing. Very disturbing. Remember the screams of Nick Berg? I still have them in my head. Horrifying. And so what ended up happening was Americans stopped trusting the defense sector of the United States. And right now, what is the most mistrusted, what is the most distrusted institution in the United States? What is the most distrusted? What is the most distrusted institution in the United States? It's the military. The military is the most untrusted. There is no institution that is less trusted than the U.S. military. So ask yourself the question, how can the American empire, or the America's global hegemony, whatever you want to call it, survive? How can it continue on when its military is its least trusted institution? And they did a whole study about this. What is the least trusted institution in America? And the studies showed that it was the military. And they asked Americans, why don't you trust the military? And one of the dominating opinions was that there isn't a moral principle to fight for. What are we fighting for by going into Iraq? What were we fighting for in Iraq? We thought we were fighting against terrorism. We were fighting against terrorists. But then we saw ISIS. In fact, even during the U.S. occupation, there was tremendous Islamic violence in Iraq. And in fact, there were over 1 million Christians living in Iraq under Saddam's regime. And once Saddam was overthrown, once he was toppled, that Christian population dwindled tremendously. Well, why would it dwindle? If we were getting rid of Saddam in the name of fighting terrorism, why would the Christian population dwindle so quickly? Because the Christian population was being protected by Saddam's government. So were we really fighting Islamic terrorism? And then you had Al-Qaeda, you had the Mujahideen in Iraq, you had, and then eventually ISIS. ISIS really popped out after America left, and there was really, once America left, and that was it. So American soldiers were there as just kind of like putting tape on a leak. That leak was about to burst out. So there's no principle, right? What are we fighting for? Are we fighting for a principle? Are we fighting in a war of good versus evil? Or are we just fighting for America's empire? And people found out that American soldiers were fighting for the empire. So ask yourself the question, how can we continue on in this hegemony? How could the American hegemony continue when Americans don't trust the military? The American military is having a very difficult time recruiting people. We have very low levels of recruitment. We're at a point where the only reason why people join the military is because they have nowhere else to go, right? The military is always hiring. The military always wants people to join it. The military is always open to new employees, and they're not getting the enlistment levels that they want. The biggest problem for the military right now is recruitment. And that's not to say that the U.S. military is weak and all that. The U.S. military is still the strongest military in the world, but looking at the future, is America going to police the world forever? Nothing lasts forever. Nothing lasts forever. That's the thing. Nothing lasts forever. And that's another thing. I remember 117 Rebel brings up a good point. He says, yeah, because Americans were disgusted with the Skittles, Alphabet, recruitment ads, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I remember back in 2014, I went to North Carolina. And while I was in North Carolina, I met with a guy who had been in the Marine Corps I'm pretty certain it was the Marine Corps, for 15 years. And he told me, he said that they are pushing the religion of the Republic of Sodom into the military. And he says it's disgusting. And I said, well, what did you do? He goes, I left the military. After 15 years of service, he said, I left the military. I want no part. I will not be a pawn for the Alphabet Mafia. So he left. And I think that his sentiment reflects a lot of people in the military. So eventually the American empire is going to be gone. It's not going to last forever. America can't do this forever. Listen, we Americans, we are very comfortable, right? We live very comfortable lives. Look at us. We're watching 4-hour streams. And I'm not talking about just this particular stream. I mean, like, you have people going online watching Asmongold for 4 hours. They just watch Asmongold. Like, that's how comfortable we are as a society. We're watching some guy in Austin, Texas, who has a filthy house, talking about video games for hours. And Asmongold's a very entertaining guy. Don't get me wrong. He's very entertaining. But that's how comfortable we are as a society. We're watching cat videos. We're watching, chickens running around. I mean, we're living very, very comfortable lives. Why in the hell would you want to go to some war? You know how horrible war is? War is the worst place you can be. I'd rather be, you know what? I would rather be in the military than be in prison. You know? But war is I remember watching a video of during the Saudi Houthi war when the Saudis were fighting in Yemen. I remember seeing a video of a Saudi soldier in the middle of the desert in Yemen saying, "I just want to go home." This guy looked like he was in his early 40s. He had glasses on. He looked like some Arab tech guy, like you would see him in Silicon Valley somewhere designing a video game. And he's like, "I just want to go home." I mean, this guy did not look fit for war at all. He's like, "I just want to go home." So here we are looking at cat videos where we're drinking pumpkin spice coffee. I got my cat here on the bed. I am talking to you guys. We're in the Matrix. Why in the hell would anybody want to join the military unless they had nowhere else to go? For the most part, that's why people join the military. You do have some families in America who are all about the military, and we call them military families. And for generations, they just joined the military, and they're very patriotic. You have those people. But for the most part, most people in the military are just there for a job. And I'm not condemning them. I'm not blaming them. I'm not making fun of them. They're just there for a job. It has nothing to do with patriotism. So eventually what's going to happen is America's going to say, "Okay, Europe, you're going to be controlled by Germany. Germany, you got Europe. Turkey, you got the Middle East. Japan, you got Asia. You got North Asia, Northeast Asia. And that's it. Peace." That's what's going to happen. And I know the Serbs are going to be happy. They're going to be happy. Oh, we're so happy. But it's not going to be fun times. Now what's going to happen when America just withdraws itself? What's going to happen is that Russia is going to expand. And Turkey and Russia are going to have a war. That's what's going to happen. Turkey, it's that simple. Turkey and Russia are going to have a war. Europe is going to become a major military bloc. Major military bloc. And the Europeans and the Turks are going to be allies. Specifically, what I really mean to say is the Germans and the Turks are going to be allies against the Russians. Now, this may not... I'm not saying this is going to happen immediately, but I think eventually this is going to be the case. Now, it could be that at one point, Germany and Russia will be allies. And the Russians are going to try to have an alliance with the Germans, and they're going to try to be friendly with the Turks and all this stuff, but it's going to be like World War II. Right? If that happens, it's going to be like World War II. Stalin and Hitler were allies, and then that didn't last very long. So I think that's what the future holds. It's going to be a big European bloc. I don't know all the details. It's impossible, but this is what I think is going to happen, roughly speaking. There's going to be a big European military bloc. The rise of Russia, the rise of Turkey, the rise of Japan, China. And China and Japan are going to have a war. That's it. I think that's, roughly speaking, that's what's going to happen. And you have to ask yourself the question. In a country where the military is the least trusted, how can this country maintain an empire? How can this country maintain a hegemony without a strong military? That's the question. Not trusting the military sounds at least like the situation during the Vietnam War. Yes. But we live... it's different. And here's the difference. The difference is in how information is spread out in the world today. So in Vietnam, there was no internet. You couldn't go on the internet. You couldn't pull out your iPhone to look up what's going on in a different country. You couldn't pull out your iPhone and go to alternative media or go on Twitter to find a narrative that was radically different from the official narrative. What you got in Vietnam, or what you got in the early 2000s, for the most part, was the official narrative. You read the newspaper. That's what it was. Now, in the early 2000s, back in 2001, when 9/11 happened, the internet was around, but nothing like what it is today. People were still reading the newspapers in 2001. People were still reading the New York Times. People were still reading Time magazine. They were looking at all that stuff. They weren't going on the internet. Alternative media was effectively non-existent. I mean, there was some things going on. Don't get me wrong, but the mainstream still dominated. What eventually happened is social media, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter. And what these platforms did was it enabled people with alternative views to become major voices. So you had 9/11 take place in 2001. What were people doing? Go on TV. Oh my God, thousands of Americans are dead. Oh my God. George Bush comes out, reads the Bible. Everybody's just, oh my God, what's going on? They're listening to George Bush. They want hope. They want comfort. People were going to church. If you had a 9/11 take place today, you wouldn't have that same energy. You wouldn't. When 9/11 happened, there were people joining the military. By the droves, joining the military. You wouldn't have that today. I'm telling you, you wouldn't have that today. If you had a massacre in America, if you had Muslims in America right now do a massacre and they killed thousands of Americans in an act of terrorism, they blew up a stadium during the Super Bowl, let's say, and thousands of people are dead. You know what would happen? People would be turning to alternative media. Yes, people would still be going to mainstream media, but they will also be going to alternative media by the droves. And you would have a divided and a fragmented opinion on what happened. And you would have a ton of people saying, this is a false flag attack, this was allowed. And some people on Twitter would be coming out saying, no, there's a report saying that men in black suits with earpieces were suspiciously walking around the football stadium an hour before the explosion. Oh, somebody said that they saw a member of the FBI next to the stadium. I mean, there would be all these stories coming out, right? Oh, we saw some rabbis dancing. I mean, people would be coming out with stories like this, right? Like, during 9/11, there were people talking about how they were Israelis dancing on a building, and those people were arrested and all that stuff. And there would be such a divided opinion. Do we go to war over this? Who did this? Do we go to war? And you would have an anti-war movement, and they would be all over the internet, and you wouldn't have that unity like you had back in the early 2000s. I don't believe you would, because of the way that information is spread today. No one's reading newspapers anymore. Newspapers are dead. All the big newspapers have now become internet newspapers. New York Times, Time magazine, they're all on the internet. That's why now you have paywalls. I remember years ago, you could go on the New York Times website. There was no paywall. You just open up the thing. Why? Because they were getting enough money. Now that no one's reading the physical newspaper, they have to have paywalls now. They all have to have paywalls. So there would be such a divide in the opinion. And people will be saying, well, why did this attack happen? Who allowed it? Now they want to push us into war. They allowed this to push us into war. And there would be people saying, this is the military-industrial complex. And you would have this Alex Jonesian opinion having a big presence in the talk, regarding such a terror attack. You just wouldn't have that unity.